Colonialism, thank you. Colonialism takes the form of gentrification now, right? And there has been droves of Black folks being displaced in communities that they've lived in for generations. Enslavement, of course, is still operated legally through our carceral system, through the prison industrial complex. But it's also about addressing harms related to Jim Crow, to food apartheid and housing redlining, which is something we still see here in Long Island. I think in 2019, Newsday did their so-called expose on continued redlining in the area. Long Island is one of the most racially and socioeconomic segregated places in the country by design. The war on drugs, right, and surveillance, which we're seeing a lot of retaliation by the state via the 2020 uprisings now on the type of surveillance that they do on Black people and communities. And so reparations is money owed. This nation is literally built on the backs of Black people and their intellectual property. Black people were capital, they were chattel, and the so-called economy would not exist without Black people. And so this is about addressing those harms. I'll pass it to Charlie if she has more to add.
Thank you so much, Nia, and good evening, everyone. For me, I recognize reparations as a policy in general is something that has been done to us, right? And not often working in the best interests of Black bodies. Policy is something that has also been extremely violent and historically anti-Black. And so in its truest sense, reparation means not only making amends for wrongful acts, but should include a monetary component to provide redress for those who have been historically wrong. And when we look at what reparations means and the legacy of chattel slavery, and specific to Black bodies in America, I recognize that chattel enslavement is a global institution, right, with a long-lasting impact of anti-Blackness and anti-Black policies in America. However, globally, however, in America, we have never properly redressed for chattel enslavement and its afterlives. And so not only must we remedy for it, but we also have to think about Jim Crow, mass incarceration, as Nia pointed out, food apartheid. This is a complete genocide, right? And this genocide is something that generationally has continued here and beyond, because what anti-Blackness is global. So for me, I recognize reparations and every policy that provides redress for institutional harms. And at the root, reparations should focus on chattel enslavement, its afterlives, and also address wealth inequity, which would require us to not only establish policies that creates a redistribution of wealth to Black Americans to build Black American wealth, but it should disproportionately benefit Black Americans, right? Because historically policy has disproportionately positioned us in a place to be oppressed and not have the wealth that we desired. And we built this country. I'll pass it back to you, Nia, if you have anything else to add.
Not in particular. I am going to be adding some resources in the chats for folks, or sending it to a host that can send it in the chat, because I can't message the larger group, but some resources that kind of explain items around, like the racial wealth gap and why it exists, because statistically speaking, Americans drastically underestimate how wide the wealth gap is between white and Black Americans.
Thank you. And looking at the documentary, you see the conflicting, aspects from different people, right, about what reparations means to them and how it should be, how this should be implemented. But asking you both, why are reparations important, you think?
reparations are important because the way our society functions and exists literally could not exist without stealing of our bodies and our labor, without land theft, right, to Indigenous people. And I want to like focus on in several items where I think we need to abandon the idea that the institution of enslavement was a few bad actors who had large plantations and a large amount of enslaved folks. So I currently work like in the legislative advocacy avenue, what have you. My background is in history and archival work. And when we look at slave logs and census reports or what have you, you have to understand that Black people were seen as property and as very valuable capital. And so there's actually a lot of records. And the truth of the matter is many average white Americans had, 1 to 2 enslaved people in their homes. It's like having a goat or a cow. It is property that helped build your wealth. We've also seen, right, in the past that the United States doesn't want to atone for how they enacted terror on Black and Indigenous folks, quite honestly. But they often do invest in white Americans. Slave owners were paid reparations after emancipation, right, for their lost labor. They did not provide the 40 acres and the mule that they promised people, but they did pass the Homestead Act, right, which gave white people large slews of land. You then have sharecroppers. In Long Island, we have both a school district and a statue dedicated to William Floyd, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He also owned slaves. And that means that Black children have to walk into a school named after a slave owner. Many of those Black children are Black Indigenous children whose family literally have been here for millennia, who have worked this land and are now being continually manipulated and harassed and abused in a variety of different ways. So if we're looking to actually repair harms, we have to be real about the things that happened. And, I think, they talked a little bit about HR 40 in the documentary. HR 40 is like the bottom of the barrel, quite honestly, because it is one, a study bill. It's just to examine if, how bad was slavery and things of this nature. And 2, it has been introduced every year since 1989 and has never been put to the floor for a vote. But during the 2020 primaries, a majority of the candidates said they supported reparations, similar to the ways in which they support student loan forgiveness, which benefits everybody, but by large would benefit Black women who are the most educated subgroup in this country, but then also face the largest harms around housing insecurity and are not valued in the workplace and often have to work 2, 3, 4 times as hard as white coworkers to get like an inkling of what they can. And so to me, it is kind of beyond necessary because it's not sustainable. We have more people enslaved, which is true, incarcerated now than we did when Black folks in the United States were so-called emancipated in 1865, right? That there is the problem, but I'll pass to Charlisa as I drop more links. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Nia. I mean, you really said everything. I think for me, the reason why reparations is so important is because often in our society, we hear about the importance of paying your bills on time, right? Paying down your debts. And one of the greatest debts in this nation is owed to my community. And that is something that has never been paid. as a Black American woman whose great-grandparents were sharecroppers and whose grandparents were tenant farmers, I think about my elders who are no longer here, but the intergenerational struggles that I face, and that my family has had to navigate as a result of chattel slavery and its afterlives. And one of the things that I think we really forget is when we have this conversation about reparations, we often shortchange it, right? We always start with 1619. And the reality is there were enslaved Africans here in this country well before 1619. And when we're talking about the institution of slavery, we have to talk about all of it and why reparations are owed. So for me, excuse me, because my Wi-Fi is acting a bit up, and I want to make sure I have my notes on point as I'm talking through this. But for me, we need reparations to address the economic, social, and political barriers that have been rooted in centuries of systemic racism and oppression for my community. And it represents an acknowledgement of the more than 500 plus years of enslavement, exploitation, discrimination that my ancestors in my current community has endured, and how this brutal history has left a lasting impact on our communities. Perpetuating wealth gaps, limiting access to resources, and creating barriers to achieve equality, right? And so by advocating for reparations as a reparationist, I believe I'm fighting for justice and recognition for those in the past, currently, right, and in the future, because this is an intergenerational fight. And I believe that reparations can build the gap, bridge the gap between the past and the present, but be able to shift some of the existing challenges that we see in our society today. One of the things that I think about is during COVID-19, during the well, we're still in COVID-19, I'm just making that very clear, but at the height of the pandemic, when the world stopped and so many people needed support, it was nothing to cut stimulus checks to address what, right? Pain that was happening in our communities, right? To address a problem. And I look at reparations the same way. Those stimulus checks were reparations for the COVID-19 pandemic. That is a prime example of how reparations can exist to address a community that has been facing harm for 500 plus years. We cannot ignore that. And so I think it's important for us to see the ways in which reparations shows up with regards to everyone universally, and how it does not show up specifically for Black Americans and being able to meet their needs. The next thing I want to say, because I know I'm like talking in circles, but I want to make sure, you know, I hit everything, is when I think about reparations, we also have to address the lineage piece, but that there are tiers. Reparations cannot be a one-time payment. Reparations cannot be this universal approach, right? We understand that it is a global issue, right? Anti-Blackness is global. When we're specifically talking about America, we have to talk about providing redress for American descendants of enslaved people, and then building off of that in tiers to support all Black folks who have been affected by white supremacy, period. And so that is something that I believe should be included in a reparations package, and it should be tiered, because this is not a one-time fits-all solution. No, we need a multi-tiered approach, a multi-year approach to ensure that reparations is the best that it can be to provide redress for the communities harmed.
That's a beautiful comparison between, COVID and, how the government reacted immediately to, provide these, checks to people, and what you're saying, and in the spirit of what you're saying, it makes me think about, one interesting thing about the documentary is, this idea that, a housing program is not enough, right? A housing program is not enough. It doesn't go far enough for, the repair that needs to be mended. But in your understanding, what form can reparations take? And I'm going to go back to Nia on this question.
Absolutely. My answer is a little bit a continuation of what Charlisa just shared with us, which is one, reparations, the form it takes is monetary. Short of a revolution, and that's what I'll say on that, is if there was race-based policy and exclusion to enact the institution of racial slavery in this country, there has to be race-based legislation and policy to redress those issues, right? And so one of the items that Charlisa brought up was the stimulus checks that we may have received during the beginning of the pandemic, right? But we have seen the United States, whether they've been successful or not at doing it, provide monetary reparations very poorly to some Indigenous people, to Japanese Americans for putting them in camps, right? We have seen, even most recently was the child tax credit that happened, right? Which overwhelmingly helped people across this country, but then was rolled back on this idea of handouts, which is ironic since they often give handouts to banks and institutions, but not to people. And this came from a Democratic senator, right? Joe Manchin is the one who didn't want to expand it because he wanted work requirements and things of that nature, even though statistically we knew that people were using the money overwhelmingly for rent, housing, right, and food. It actually didn't have any real impact on people's labor participation, right, in the workforce. Money, unfortunately, is the root of so many harms. Money indicates, and race indicates where you can live, the quality of food that you have access to, the quality of education, what health outcomes you will have. And I wish it was as simple to say, then let's have our own autonomous zones. But we know that one, in reference to like Indigenous sovereignty, is like, it's laughable to have your oppressors, your colonizers have to recognize you in that way, and that they also don't adhere to the things that they like, oh, you can have your own space and govern the way you want to. They still enact harms over them. And we're living in a country right now that is introducing legislation that would roll back Black history, which is illogical to me. I don't know how you're going to be teaching about dead presidents, but you're not going to be teaching about who built the White House, or some ideas about expanding Social Security because it's alien or whatever, which would require them to raise the age of retirement, which is also laughable, but also really troubling because the life expectancy of a Black man in America is 68, but they would have to raise it to 70, right? People are in crisis now, and they've been in crisis, and this money is owed. And so as much as that there are policy pieces to address other aspects, right, around education access, the carceral system, medical access, or what have you, healthcare, you have to actually then pay out monetary payments to people who have been continually harmed since the iteration of the so-called settler state that we call the United States of America.
And Charlisa?
Yes. Can we repeat the question for me so I can make sure I'm...
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking of in the film, there are people that are question, the housing program, right? In the film, whether this goes far enough. So, our question is, what form can reparations take? Since it's a very debatable item,
Absolutely. One of the links that I do want to share is from the Brookings Institute. I think this was done in 2020, but they did an entire panel on reparations for Black Americans, whether, why, and how. I would advise everyone who was in attendance today, I'm sharing the link with Joe, to watch this, and I'll tap into my response. My challenge here is that we often mask policies that are not really reparations as reparations, right? And any policy that provides breadcrumbs to the challenges that we see in our society, but don't necessarily repair the collective needs, or address the root causes of what the Black community is experiencing. I have an issue with that, because I feel like we can always do more. And we have to listen to people within the community with their concerns, how they feel about whether or not this is a true reparations policy. Don't get me wrong, it does provide redress, but when it replicates the same type of policies that we've seen over and over again, I don't believe that is going to be that effective. We need revolutionary policy. And too often we'll take a policy that is good or has the makings of what could really be a great framework for reparations, and we're like, we're championing this as reparations, even though it really does not get at the root of what reparations should be. And so I think some examples of what forms reparations can take is eradicating debt, right? Not having Black people pay taxes, providing direct monetary policy, having race-specific policy. One of the things that Nia said is that, you know, there were policies that were specific to harming us. We need policy change that directly gets at creating solutions in our lives, right? And so that needs to be race-specific. Oftentimes within the policy setting, when people are addressing issues that are in the Black community, and I say this as a former analyst who has served doing work in the New York State government, sometimes they want to take a one-size-fits-all approach, a universal approach that doesn't necessarily address this specific community. And I think it's okay to say every community has their own challenges, and we need to be able to address them as such. With Black people, oftentimes we hear, well, this community is suffering too. And it's like, yes, but I'm talking specifically to what needs the Black community needs right now. And so if we remove anti-Blackness, if we really work on bias to address getting at the root causes and creating policies that meet the needs of our communities, we can start to see real reparative policies that we can call reparations, right? And once again, I want to reiterate that reparations should be tier policy to address enslavement and its afterlives, and currently what we're seeing today. And we should be champion for reparations, because this is not something, you know, people love to say we're so far removed, and we are still living in a world today where Black people are being murdered for being Black. Like, did we forget about the Black massacre that happened in Buffalo, New York? I'm a Rochester, New York native. You know, this happened literally in our backyard. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that the same institutions that have harmed us 500 plus years ago are the same institutions that exist today. And the only way that we can address it is with the right reparative policies that are rooted in providing redress and addressing the root causes of the challenges that we see today.
Amazing, Charlisa. And in the interest of time, I'm gonna, turn it over to either Ting or Joe. Are you able to point to the next question?
Yes, please. Catherine wants to know about the reparations program in Evanston. And do you think the documentary represented the issues around reparations well? Or did it leave out anything?
I am going to add a link for an article that I read when this Evanston policy was rolled out. And I think it really gets to how I personally feel about it. So I'm going to just share that and drop that, but I'm going to go on mute, and I'll leave the floor to Nia before I hop back in.
Okay. So my personal feelings are that it is a nice thought, and niceness is also a a tool of whiteness as it operates in the United States, right? That you have to do things very politely, which is ironic because the United States is built on a revolution, but it's a revolution for very specific people. It does not fully encompass what would be necessary to repair. And ironically, and I think I just shared this on my Instagram today, but like there's a quote by James Baldwin, right, about how progressiveness or what have you can be seen as very like on the surface, right? Like everything will look nice on top. They'll breadcrumb you. So the arguments are around like, oh, we had a Black president, or we have, the most diverse New York State legislature that we've ever had. Kind of like these representative things, right? Like Target has a whole little Black history section. But again, incarceration is growing, and it is higher than it was when we were literally enslaved under the state. We have policies to erase literal histories, policies to negate body agency, right? This is one of the largest talking points around the rollback on Roe v. Wade, where many white women typically come out in the imagery of Handmaid's Tale, negating the fact that the source material for that is how the United States actually enacted terror on Black women's bodies, right? So I don't believe if it doesn't reach the core, it's really not good enough. And in many ways, I would say the state is more powerful now, right, than it was before, because it has this ability to like co-opt movements and make things about branding and niceness, and not so much about like, how do we actually address this issue? So I see, thank you, Joe shared the link that Charlisa was referring to from US Today on Evanston, and also shared, it's a PDF toolkit. We have a budget request letter that is circulating the state Senate, so New York State or state legislature, which requires or includes a couple of demands and or requests for the budget, which includes Daniel's law around Daniel Prude, who was executed by police in Rochester, New York. It includes the demand that we have a reparations commission founded for New York State, and reminding people that New York State was a colony, right? That enslavement existed here on Long Island, that the largest colonial era African-American burial ground is in New York City. And that Central Park was a Black village, right? Like Black people lived there. There's constant erasure. I think now they call Bed-Stuy something different. I don't know. I was in Bed-Stuy the other day and my Google map said some ridiculous name. And it's just like, be for real. I think maybe a better example of that for local people is like, if you're by Hofstra, right? Hofstra University is physically in Hempstead, but will come up as East Garden City. East Garden City is not a real place. It doesn't exist. It's not a mailing address. The same could be said for the Westbury Newcastle line, which is Newcastle doesn't actually exist. It's not a mailing address. The people in Newcastle live in Westbury. What they're saying is that Black people and immigrants live in Newcastle, and mostly middle class to wealthy white people live in Westbury proper. It's very coded language.
Wow. Thank you for enlightening us and educating us and being real with us as well. I'm liking this conversation. Are you ready, Charlisa?
Yes. Gonna keep it real short and sweet. For me, I think this is a breadcrumbing program, and it doesn't do enough, right? When we're talking about reparations, it's important for us to meet the need. And I think this does a little bit of that, but not enough that is sufficient to the community. And for those who directly live there, for those who are directly impacted, if they're saying that this program is not sufficient enough, then it's not. If they're saying that white people are championing this program because, oh yeah, it sounds great, it's no. Okay, it's not enough, because if it was a real reparations program, there would be massive outrage. And that is because people don't understand that reparations is not a handout, it's a hand up. And quite frankly, I'm tired of hearing language about reparations being a handout when white folks have received the biggest handout on the backs of Black bodies. And so we have to be honest about the way we look at reparations, the way we talk about reparations, the way we label policies as reparations, right? And what this article gets a real sense of addressing is we must start focusing on cash-based reparations programs. One of the links that was shared earlier addresses the racial wealth chasm, right? And how you can tell people all day, go get an education, buy a house, right? Open a business. None of these things are helping Black Americans close the racial wealth gap. It is 500 plus years growing, right? And so we really need institutional change, systemic change. We need monetary change in order to close the racial wealth chasm. And the only way to do that is to start creating policies that are cash-based. And those are the type of policies I think we should champion.
Thank you. Thank you. We have more questions, and I want to see what we could do to get them out there. Sting, can you read another question?
Sure. Toby wants to know, she understands reparation will be monetary, but will it also address things like redlining, gentrification, and things that are not cash directly? And will it be tied to the George Floyd, John Lewis Voting Rights Act in any way?
Yes, because that's reparations. That's the afterlives of chattel slavery that exists in the same system. And because it exists within the same system, it must be addressed as such. And those things are cash related, right? But they're also institutional policies. They're also policies that address the root cause. And so those things must be included. And as far as I'm concerned, anything that has to do with Black people dying from state-sanctioned violence requires a check and also policy change.
So +1, everything that Charlie says is gold. I just want to put a little asterisk at the George Floyd and Policing Act is a pro-police piece of legislation that would actually give more money to police, and that y'all should be looking at the Breathe Act as presented by the Movement for Black Lives, which discusses divestment of funds and reallocation to funds or to areas in which reduce harms, right? So we know that the safest communities in our country or what have you, and I mean, here Nassau County is like the safest county in the country, but they want to keep building up the police and whatnot. They have green spaces, they have housing, they have grocery stores with produce. They have resources. And so the Movement for Black Lives, like I've mentioned in the chat, is a nationwide network of Black led organizations, individuals, organizers, what have you, that put this piece of policy together. It is also part of our official New York State budget request that they create a New York State iteration of the Breathe Act. For to address those kinds of longstanding harms. I just want to be sure people know that, because Black organizers on the ground are not supporting the George Floyd and Policing Act. That is highly touted by centrist, moderate, Dems, Republicans. They're all the same people. And I just want to make sure y'all know.
Thanks for breaking that down, Nia.
Amen. Yes. Ting, another question?
One more. Susan wants to know, if I have this right, Susan, could reparations also address generational trauma? Safe for whom, she says.
What's the last part of it?
Safe for whom?
Faith?
Safe, S-A-F-E? I'm not sure what she means by that exactly.
Okay. I think that's an interesting question, and it's a little hard. I'm wondering how Charlisa is thinking about it, because generational trauma is very real, right? And if we look at the concepts of like epigenetics, it's like your literal DNA changes due to trauma. And so we have secular instances of trauma that run in families and communities or what have you. And although I think policy would address some of the issues that created those traumas, I think it takes time and living in a space where you're actually safe to then to repair those traumas, right? Because if it's something that has been learned over and over again, your body's going to react the same way, right? Like in a very like not exact comparison, but like abused folks and or animals, right, might flinch when they hear a loud noise or something like it's a very like lived experience. And so I can't say that, you know, if they pass monetary reparations, housing, cancel student debt, that like I'm going to be healed, because there are other ways in which the institution of whiteness in this country has harmed me that cannot be repaired that way. I'm gonna pass it to Charlie if she has anything to add to that, but that would be my first answer.
I think you're right on the money, Nia. And one of the things that I would say is that reparations can help us getting the resources that we need, right, to improve and work through our generational trauma. Because generational trauma is something that is going to take time to navigate through. But therapy also can be very expensive for us. Therapy can also be something that feels very inaccessible, right? And I started therapy later on in my journey. I have people in my community who are not able to access therapy. And when we're talking about navigating through generational trauma, you need resources, right? You need support, and we need monetary resources in order to do that. So I definitely do believe that reparations can help aid and help in that way, right? But it is not going to be, oh, one day I wake up, oh, I'm healed. That's not how this works, right? I got trauma in me from my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, okay? And those are things that will take time to work and navigate through. And we will forever live in a world where white supremacy exists. It's embedded. There's templates here. And so we have to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I would, adding that very last piece that you said, Charlie, is because anti-Blackness has been part of our socialization and part of the ethos of this country, right? It would require such a major structural and cultural change in this country for that type of repair to really happen if you're talking about trauma, because things as simple as the fact that it was a legal practice, right, for Black women and girls to be sexually assaulted. It was not considered assault. Leads directly now to the hypersexualization and adultification of Black women and girls. It's the reason why Black women and girls are largely not believed in instances of sexual assault or harassment, because there is kind of this background history of like, oh, well, like we always did that or something like that. Another kind of correlation of that, which is really horrifying, is the idea of marital rape, which was legally okay into the 1970s, right? And so this is why we have like items of rape culture, because it's just like, oh, that's how we live. I believe whatchamacallit, former governor was like, oh, I'm Italian, that's just what we do. It's like, that doesn't make it okay. You should not touch people that don't want to be touched, right? People have their own body autonomies, but if it's something that lives in our society and our culture, that takes much more than just policy-based transitions.
Wow. Well, it's been really edifying, and we are grateful to have you both here. Powerful information, and I'm gonna look all that information that you posted, all those links. That is important information to build ourselves, to grow, and to understand. And so I'm going to be looking at that information. So thank you. And we do have to wrap it up, unfortunately, because we are closing into almost 2.5 hours. But once again, thank you, Nia and Charlisa, for being here with us today. And we're grateful. So, and with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Ting with some house rules, last things.
Okay. Thank you all. This has really been a lot to take in, and I think it's just the beginning of a conversation, and we'll try and carry it forward as best we can. I put 3 links in the chat, one for the survey. We ask you, please take the survey. We'll email it to you as well, but if you can do it ahead of time, that's great. You might want to watch our race class forum, which has some very similar ideas that might be useful. And if you can, sign up to join us so we can keep on doing this kind of stuff. And I'll hand it back over to Carrie to close it out.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to these 2 wonderful women who pretty much bared what needs to be said. And it's often difficult for us white folk to hear some of the stuff that you have to say. And we have a lot to take in, and we will continue working with you and with ourselves. And we need to repair generations of hurt. So thank you for being willing to share your thoughts with us tonight. As Ting said, please, our participants, I hope you will avail yourself of the race class forum. There's a link for that, and all of the materials that have been provided to us tonight. We will be sending a follow-up email with all of the links. And please join NIPAN, donate to NIPAN so that we can continue to hold important forums of this sort. Thank you all so much for attending and for sharing your thoughts. And with that, I bid you all a very good night, thoughtful and good night.